Today I'm going to talk about a term in economics I may actually be coining, though I find that difficult to believe, and that term is interference. Before I can talk about interference, I need to talk about another term, and that is consent, as I will often be repeating the phrase mutually consensual transaction during this presentation. In a transaction, it is ideal for all parties to the transaction to be consenting. I'll be using the example of Farmer Brown and Farrier Smith throughout this presentation for the sake of clarity. Consent can be mutual or it can be unilateral in a transaction. It can be removed entirely as well. However, for the purposes of this presentation, we need not be concerned with those cases just yet. In our example, Farmer Brown offers to give Farrier Smith 10 bushels of oats in exchange for a year worth of ferrying services, and Smith agrees. In this case, both parties have offered their consent to the transaction. This is an example of a mutually consensual transaction, as all parties have offered their consent. There are cases in which parties to a transaction are not obvious, and their consent should be sought before the transaction be considered entirely mutually consensual. For the sake of simplicity, these cases will be set aside momentarily. It should also be noted that in this exchange I have deliberately left out currency and deliberately created a transaction that made use of an exchange of both tangible goods and intangible services to show that this economic theory applies in all types of transactions. It should be noted as well that the introduction of currency to the transaction does not act to simplify the transaction, but instead to complicate it, and is part of why, for the purposes of this presentation, it has been excluded. In a unilaterally consensual transaction, one party offers consent to the transaction, and the other does not. Most of these types of transactions actually never take place, as, in most cases, when a party does not offer consent, the transaction collapses. In the case of Farmer Brown and Farrier Smith, if Smith breaks into Brown's silo and simply steals the oats without Brown's consent, the transaction is unilaterally consensual, as Smith has obviously offered his consent and Brown has not. Conversely, if Brown loads his musket and plants the end of its barrel firmly on the back of Smith's skull, and then proceeds to demand Smith shoe Brown's horses or die, Brown has removed the element of consent from Smith, because Smith now has no choice but to shoe Brown's horses. There is a greater philosophical reason as to why Smith cannot offer his consent to death in this circumstance, but that discussion extends far beyond the purposes of this presentation. In either case, it would be better if the transaction was entirely mutually consensual, as we can then clearly see that, in this example, Brown would rather have his horses shoed than have the 10 bushels of oats, and Smith would rather have the oats than spend his time doing something else, such as producing his own oats. In this case, the transaction has made both parties wealthier, and both parties, to at least some degree, more productive in their future endeavors. If the element of consent is removed, we, at best, cannot determine if the parties would benefit from it, and, at worst, from a strictly economic perspective, we have greatly damaged at least one of the parties and made them poorer. We can also see that, if we extrapolate this exchange to a much larger scale, an ideal economic plane would act to maximize the number of mutually consensual transactions, as that will have the tendency to, over time, introduce more parties to mutually consensual transactions, and will introduce greater wealth to those individuals that engage in such. Further, if Brown and Smith are very good at what they do, the newly shoed horses will allow Brown to make more oats in that year than the 10 he exchanged for ferrying services, and Smith will have more oats to eat or feed his stock than he could have otherwise produced in the time he spent shoeing Brown's horses. If they are not very good at what they do, they will be forced to either find a better exchange, find better parties to the exchange, invent a new method to benefit the exchange, or starve. You can imagine the likelihood that either party chooses the latter, and this choice is at least part of why it is in our very nature to innovate. Before I move on, I recommend further reading on the term consideration as it relates to contracted transactions, as the terms consideration and content in contract law often work hand in hand. This next slide will attempt to show the price of a good or service over time. It is human nature to innovate, and with the free exchange of ideas, humans can maximize innovation in a marketplace. In a market, ideas are exchanged in much the same manner as goods and services, and if made in entirely mutually consensual transactions, will act to make a society wealthier in ideas. This line is the natural price of goods or services over time. This line is flat. This represents a scenario in which no mutually consensual transactions take place. In all of human existence, this has never been the case. In fact, in civilized societies in which mutually consensual transactions are maximized, this price point, even in nominal terms, tends to decline. The blue dotted line has been included to show a flat price point for visual clarity. In today's market, a few products fall into this category. Laser vision correction services have, in nominal terms, become significantly less expensive over time, despite becoming significantly higher in quality and greater in supply. Televisions are much the same. A cathode ray tube television that may have cost $300 in 2000, even in absolutely new condition, cannot even be given away in today's market, and it is for that reason that manufacturers of television do not make any cathode ray tube television sets anymore. Instead, for that same $300, you could get a much larger LED or LCD flat panel television with much greater picture quality and with much greater ease of transport and installation. The thing that accounts in its entirety for this gap, this reduction in prices, is innovation. That said, in today's market, prices of equivalent goods more often actually increase in nominal price over time. What causes this price increase? Some might say currency inflation. This does not act to answer the question at its root, as this answer begs the question: what causes prices to inflate over time? I've highlighted the area between these two trends to indicate the difference between what we typically see in practice and what should be happening, as prices should not just remain flat, they should actually decrease over time for equivalent goods and services. This red area is what I have called interference. What is interference, and what is being interfered with? In this case, the term interference refers to any obstacle that would fundamentally limit or obstruct the maximization of mutually consensual transactions. It is important to note that pre-existing outside circumstances are inherent to any transaction's terms, so things like weather are not elements of interference, though they may introduce an unconsidered or poorly understood element of risk to the transaction. Interference can come from a number of sources. Criminality or hoodlumism are sources of interference as they remove the element of consent from a transaction, or can remove the transaction itself from consideration entirely. Sudden and cataclysmic geological changes, although extraordinarily rare, can act as a source of interference as a major tectonic shift might, for example, bury a large vein of copper, thereby radically changing the nature of the goods' scarcity as a resource. In the case of Brown and Smith, if they are located in New England, where major sudden and cataclysmic tectonic shifts are extraordinarily rare, if an earthquake opens up a chasm that consumes Brown's silo before the physical exchange could possibly take place, then the transaction has met with real interference. By contrast, if the same transaction took place in San Francisco, where earthquakes are far more common, Smith would engage in a transaction with the common knowledge of the risk of earthquake, and should expect Brown to build a silo that could withstand the pre-existing risk of earthquake. Note that gradual changes cannot be a source of interference as they are ongoing, and the changes themselves represent pre-existing conditions. That said, we all should know by now that the greatest and most pervasive source of interference today is governmental. Before I move on, I want to spend a moment clarifying interference as it relates to mutually consensual transactions. Interference can be applied to two parts of the equation, the first being mutual consent, and the second being the transaction itself. Interference with consent would manifest, in our example, as Smith stealing Brown's oats, hoodlums destroying Brown's silo, or Brown ordering Smith to shoe his horses at gunpoint. Government can do the same, either by seizing Brown's oats or, even if at the request of Brown, ordering Smith at gunpoint to shoe Brown's horses. In our example, the transaction itself can be interfered with even if both parties engage with mutual consent. If Brown and Smith agree to the aforementioned terms, and hoodlums murder both Brown and Smith, the transaction itself, although mutually consented, has been interfered with. This type of interference is far more commonly conducted and far more easily conceived as by government, as when a police force or military force orders at gunpoint the two parties to not engage in the transaction. In practicum, the police force or military force of a governing body is only rarely ever involved in these type of cases, but it is with this threat of violence that a governing agency issues its orders. This is not to suggest that governmental interference is entirely bad, as it can act to mitigate other sources of interference, even if that source of interference is, for example, the invading armies of another government. In this slide, we have an example of the pre-existing level of interference. This black bar, as it relates to our previous graph, represents the distance between the line labeled actual price change and the line natural price change at a given point of time. This green line represents the new introduction of a hypothetical source of governmental interference. In this hypothetical, this red line now represents the amount of pre-existing interference the new governmental interferences act to reduce, and the blue line represents the amount of pre-existing interference that remains once the governmental interference is introduced. When the newly introduced governmental interference is added to the remaining pre-existing governmental interference, the new total level of interference is, as we can see in this hypothetical, significantly less than the pre-existing level of interference. In this hypothetical, governmental interference can, from a strictly economic perspective, be justified, although there are sure to be other considerations to be made on a specific act of governmental interference. These circumstances are, admittedly, quite rare in today's society. A more realistic representation of the effects of governmental interference are as follows. The green line represents the amount of governmental interference introduced, the red the amount reduced, and the blue the amount left over. When combined, the newly introduced governmental interference and the remaining pre-existing interference total a new level of interference that far exceeds the pre-existing levels of interference. From a policy standpoint, the term interference and the application in practice should act as a threshold heuristic. By that I mean that policy should first pass the interference test before other applicable considerations are made. If the policy does not at least meet the interference test, then, as it will have the tendency to, as previously mentioned, restrict the advancement of society in any objective or measurable term, preclude the reduction of poverty, and, at its worst, act to incite our most violent tendencies, the policy should no longer be considered. I will explain how interference actually acts to detract from acceptable societal value systems, including how interference actually acts to incite our most violent tendencies in my next video, which will demonstrate the application of interference with a modern, large-scale transaction, and how interference makes transactions more expensive, which, in turn, makes all products and services in a marketplace more expensive. So if you've liked this presentation, stay tuned, subscribe, and I will have a new video out for you shortly. As always, I welcome your input in the comments section and encourage viewers who enjoyed to click the like button. Until the next time, this is Mike from the Captain Phoenix channel, signing off.